Welcome back to the channel and to level 6 of the Financial Sacrifices series. Let's get right into it. Alright, in levels 1 through 4, which are linked below, we discuss the steps that you can take on your own to start saving money in your current financial situation without major lifestyle changes. And then in the level 5 video, which is also linked below, we discuss the first major lifestyle change, which is getting roommates to save up to $25,000 per year. Now there's going to be a level 7 where I kind of tie all the concepts together, but this will be the final video in this format where I give you a cost breakdown and tell you what I did to save money. Going back to level 5, I discussed changing your living scenario to reduce your living costs, mainly through getting roommates and getting housing that meets your needs but isn't more than you need. Or you can move closer to your job, you can carpool with a coworker, or you can do all of these things to try to save yourself money. But at the end of the day, those are all kind of limited to your same scenario, right? You're still going to the same job, you're still living within the same area, even if it's not within the exact same house or the exact same apartment. So what this video discusses is what if you weren't limited by those constraints? Some of you might have noticed this, but in every single example I've given in all the levels throughout this series, I always add a caveat at the end. I add a little disclaimer. So for example, I'll go through my example, but I'll say if your pre-tax income is this, your post-tax income is this, depending on your state, depending on where you live. Or I'll say these are the prices around where I live, because again, they might be different where you are depending on the cost of living in your area. So it's almost like all of that was in preparation for this. Like I planned ahead, like I knew this was coming. Yeah. And with that, welcome to level 6, and that is moving, like changing states. This is moving to a new location. This is the cost of living adjustment, tax differences, including will it be worth moving to a city for a higher paying job if the cost of living is also going to go up. There's a lot to cover here, so let's get started. All right, in the prior levels, everything I discussed was about cutting back. It's about making your money go farther, getting the best value you could within your current circumstances. But as I've said previously, you can't cut back after a certain point. For example, even if I lived in total darkness all the time, my electric bill would still not be $0. Or another example, you can minimize the amount that you drive so that you use less gas and therefore spend less money on it, but at the end of the day, if you still have to drive to work, it's probably not an expense that you can eliminate altogether, and you can't control the price of gasoline. You might go to a cheaper gas station nearby to fill up the gas tank in your car, but at the end of the day, you can't make the price of gas any lower. There is a very real price of entry to survival, right? There is a threshold that you cannot get your costs below unless you want to risk not living. But here's the catch. That baseline cost changes depending on where you live. So that's today's lesson. How do you evaluate those living costs compared to what the income level is within those regions to determine whether or not it's worth moving? Let's go directly into an example here. I'll start this as simply as I can. Whenever you're evaluating this, you have to look at it from two perspectives. You have the expenses side and then you have the income side. Now, starting with expenses, we already know that the cost of goods and services vary depending on the region you're in. So for example, if you're trying to buy a house in like New York or Los Angeles, it's going to be a lot more expensive than buying a comparable house in the middle of nowhere in Iowa. So depending on where you live, the essentials that you need to survive. So for example, housing, utilities, groceries, vehicle registration, taxes or insurance costs, healthcare, internet access, all these things, the prices vary from one region to another. Sometimes they're higher, sometimes they're lower, or sometimes it's a combination where a couple of them will be higher and the rest will be lower. But going to the other side of the coin, looking at the income side, like I said, big cities like LA, New York, Boston, they have higher living costs, but they also pay higher wages to try to attract new workers to offset that living cost. Does that also inherently drive up prices long term and then just kind of compound the issue? Yes, but that is a different topic. Just know that on average, living cost is higher, but so is pay. But from a personal finance perspective, the key here is factoring in how both of these affect you at the individual level. Does that increase in living costs justify the increase in salary? Or on the other hand, if you take a pay cut, does the cost of living go down enough that it outweighs that pay cut? And before you say, oh, I'm really bad at math, and that sounds like it's hard to calculate, guess what? You don't need to be good at math. Let me make this really easy for you. I have linked a website in the description below. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, and what this website does is calculate the cost of living for you. But let's say for some reason you don't like this one, literally go into Google and type in cost of living adjustment calculator. You can pick your favorite one. They all do pretty much the same thing. But there you go. There's already a ton of calculators out there, so you can go back to being a stupid, useless, lazy piece of But seriously though, this is about as easy as it gets. So how to use this is you type in your current living location, you type in the location of where you're considering moving to, and then you enter your annual income or an estimated income, and then it tells you how much money you need to make to maintain the same quality of life that you currently have in that new location that you're considering. So just for a point of reference here, I live in southern New Hampshire. The biggest city in New Hampshire is Manchester, New Hampshire, which is pretty close to me. But on the other hand, Boston, Massachusetts is about 45 minutes away from me, which means it's within driving distance if I wanted to get a job there. So using this calculator, let's say I make $75,000 a year pre-tax in Manchester, New Hampshire, but I'm thinking about moving to Boston rather than commuting. If I want to maintain the same quality of life, I want to drive my same vehicles, I want to have a house that's similar to my current one, I want to have the same access to healthcare, get the same type of groceries, and eat the same amount of food to maintain that current lifestyle, but to do it in Boston, Massachusetts, I would have to make about $110,000 per year. But not only that, this calculator breaks down how those expenses fall into each category. What the calculator does is it says you probably spend this much on average in each category, and then on average, these categories are this amount more expensive. So it takes those two numbers, it combines them together to get your predicted living cost, and that's how it gives you the cost of living adjustment. So looking at this breakdown, you can see utilities are about the same price between the two, which makes sense because they're not that far apart. So the sources of electricity and the sources of gas are probably similar, but everything else is somewhere between moderately and significantly more expensive in Boston than it is in New Hampshire. So for example, groceries are roughly 6% more expensive. Healthcare is roughly 8% more expensive. Miscellaneous expenses, which includes entertainment expenses, the cost of repairs or other services, that's about 6% more expensive on average. But transportation and housing costs, which are already two of the larger expenses in my current region, are respectively 50% and 150% more expensive in Boston, Massachusetts. So for example, I checked the cost to insure all of my vehicles in Manchester, New Hampshire, and then to get the same coverage in Boston, Massachusetts. I own 2 cars and a motorcycle. It was about $1,700 a year in Manchester, New Hampshire with pretty good coverage limits. Boston, Massachusetts was about $3,800 a year. That was the cheapest quote I could find. That's almost $2,000 more per year for the exact same coverage on the exact same vehicles. Then look at the median home price. In Boston, it's more than 2 times the cost of the median home price in Manchester, New Hampshire. When you factor all these together, that's why you need 45.7% more money in Boston to have the same quality of life that you would have in Manchester, New Hampshire. So again, to have literally no change in your quality of life, you need 50% more money to do it, which last I checked is a lot, which makes these cost of living adjustment calculators a great starting point to demonstrate how much more costly one area can be relative to another. But the other thing it does is provide context to a level of income. Because like I said earlier, there's the expenses side, there's the income side, but those numbers independently are useless until you factor them together. Because right now, if you had no idea where I lived and I just said, oh, I make $100,000 a year, somebody in like a really rural area of Ohio or Iowa or Indiana might be like, wow, that is a ton of money. But then somebody in like LA or San Francisco would be like, wow, this guy is a peasant. He's probably homeless, but hopefully he's still gluten-free. This calculator is a very strong tool, but it is only a good starting point. The reality is there's a lot of limitations to something like this, which they directly tell you on the website when you're doing this calculation. There's several things that they don't consider within this. So for example, they don't consider state taxes or local income taxes. They don't consider sales taxes. They also don't consider things like childcare expenses. They consider homeowner costs, but they don't consider cost of renting. And granted, housing prices versus rental costs, those are usually pretty closely tied because one dictates the other. But if you look back even at the prior levels within this series, as well as my intro to budgeting series, which I'll link in the description below, I always tell people to start by looking at their actual expenses to see where their money is going. The thing about these calculators is these are based on averages. This is where the average person spends their money and what the average person will see for an increase or decrease in cost. But that could impact you differently depending on how you spend your money. So like I said, I have 3 vehicles. That's not normal for most people. Most people have 1 car. That's it. That's all they need. So for me, if transportation costs are 50% higher and I have 3 times the normal number of vehicles, a 50% increase to transportation costs from from the cost of insurance or registration or whatever else, that impacts somebody like me with multiple vehicles a lot more than it impacts somebody with one car. But if you're somebody who doesn't have a car, that doesn't matter to you. But on the other hand, I don't really go out to eat, so the 6% increase in cost to go out, that doesn't really impact me. But if you go out to eat 4 or 5 times a week, the entertainment expenses increase, that will impact you more. But so far, that's really covered the financial aspect. There's also the personal aspect of this, right? Are you going to truly like the area? Do you know people nearby? Are you going to have friends nearby? Is there family nearby? And beyond that, are there good jobs for your career within that area? So for example, I'm an engineer, but if I were to move to somewhere that was mostly farmland that has a really low cost of living, it's great that my living cost goes down, but the reality is there's not quite as many engineer jobs on a farm, so I probably wouldn't make the same amount of money there. And here's one of the other things, right, is this is assuming that you live within that city and not that you work there, but you commute there from a less expensive area. So taking all of this information, here is what I'm going to recommend, okay? If you're considering moving to a new place, either because it has more pay or because it has a cheaper cost of living, and you've gone through the personal aspect of it, you decided that this is somewhere that's right for you, it's somewhere that you really want to live, start by using the cost of living adjustment calculator as a baseline to see, okay, roughly what would I need to make for income to justify that cost difference. And if you're still serious about it, it's still something that interests you, create a real budget for yourself based on the real expenses in that area, based on what you actually do or would do in that area, and based on how you actually spend your money based on your personal spending history. So for example, let's say you want to move to a new city, look up job listings within your career in that area to get a better idea of what the pay will be. Ideally, you could also interview for a few of those positions and get like an actual job offer so you know the real number and not just like a ballpark estimate. But either way, I really recommend knowing how much you're going to make before you just kind of move out there on a whim and sign a lease for an apartment only to find out that you can't afford it. That'll take care of the income side of it. Now you have to evaluate your expenses. So what I would recommend doing is looking up actual places that are available for rent that are within commuting distance to your job that you would actually want to live. And the upfront rent cost is only part of the equation. You also have to know what your utilities are going to be. So what I would recommend doing, especially if you're serious about this, contact the landlord or whoever's renting it and see if you can get the utility bills for the last 6 months or the last 12 months. And that'll give you a real number for utility bills, for electric, for heating, for cooling, and you'll know your real cost for that specific apartment so you know which one is truly the best option for you. Then you have to calculate your commuting costs. So for example, if you have 2 places, one's really close to your job and one's really far away, if the cost of gas in that area is really cheap, a longer drive isn't going to cost you that much more money, but if you save substantially on rent, it's probably worthwhile. And then beyond that, it's all of the generic stuff that you budget for. So going out to eat, car expenses, entertainment expenses. Again, look at your actual historic spending, break it down into each of these categories, and multiply your current expenses by the calculator's adjustment rate to figure out how much you're going to spend in the new area, assuming you do the same things. So let me give you an example. Let's say I spend an average of $300 a month on groceries and I live in Manchester, New Hampshire. But if I move to Boston, it's 5.8% more expensive for groceries. That means I would multiply my grocery bill by 1.058 because again, 5.8% more expensive, which means my estimated grocery bill would be $317.40 per month. But you want to do that for all the categories that you spend money on and actually allocate what percent that you put into each basket. The more specific that you can get using these calculators numbers, the more accurate of an estimate you'll have. And quite frankly, the more likely you are to succeed financially if you do make that jump. And finally, and this is a big one, do not forget about taxes. Like I said, the calculator excludes these. Whether or not the new area is higher or lower, this is something that you have to factor in. You could have a state tax, you could have like a local municipality, so like New York City has an income tax as well. It could even be an indirect tax. So for example, some states charge property tax on vehicles, property tax on housing is different in different regions. There could be a sales tax. Any of these taxes, you have to factor those in. Because if you don't factor everything in and you take a plunge and you go to a place that has a higher pay, if you don't factor in everything perfectly, you might find that your pay went up a lot less than your cost of living went up. So once again, the more detail you can get, the more likely that you are to succeed financially. Well, let's talk about how much money I saved by doing this and how these numbers impacted me. When I first graduated college, the first job I had was 2 states away from where I currently live, which means I moved at some point. I found a new job, I packed up my stuff, and I moved to the state that I'm currently in. But let's look at some numbers here though, okay? I was living in a state where I was paying roughly 5.5% to state income tax. Then that state had a sales tax as well. That was 6.35%. So there were some things that were excluded, such as groceries, but but other than that, everything else was taxed. But in addition to that, they taxed the absolute crap out of vehicles. At the time I was living there, I had a 2002 Subaru Impreza, and I sold it when I was living down there. And when I sold it, it was 14 years old, it had 175,000 miles, it had rust in all the places you expect, and even so, they charged me $800 a year in property taxes just to keep it on the road. And that property tax is in addition to the registration cost. Now, like I said at the start of the series, I did not make a lot of money at that time. I was struggling to pay my bills, I was living paycheck to paycheck, but when I started doing the math of how much I paid in state taxes alone when I was living there, between the income tax, between the sales tax, and the vehicle property taxes, I was paying roughly $7,000 a year in state taxes alone, which is a little less than $600 a month or $150 per week only in state taxes. Let me phrase this a different way, okay? I was paying roughly 11.5% of my total pre-tax income only to state taxes, but I had no money to go out to eat. I couldn't buy myself new clothes. I was living paycheck to paycheck. I didn't really have any money left over to do the things I wanted to do or to do fun activities. I was struggling to get by and to pay for the bare essentials when I was paying $600 a month in state taxes, which is insane. Like, that's completely nuts. So when I really started digging into the state taxes and the state expenses, it really was not sustainable to live in that area at that level of income. Simply put, there was no possible way for me to make that work long term. Not only could I not hit my long-term goals and get to where I am today and to be where I wanted to be financially, but I could barely pay for rent. I could barely pay for groceries, and that was living with at least 2 other people. Granted, there was a couple other things going on too, right? So when I first graduated college, the job market was not great. The economy was not doing phenomenal. Engineering jobs were a little bit limited, and there was a lot more engineers than there were jobs at the time. So you kind of had to take what you could get. And as a result of that, I was already relatively underpaid in that position, but on top of that, annual raises were like 2.5%, which isn't exactly great. So when I started looking at the long-term living costs there versus my income potential, it became very apparent very quickly that leaving was the only long-term option. So that's when I started looking at the cost of living adjustment versus salaries in different regions. Looking at this from both sides, right? The income side as well as the expenses side, my lowest competing job offer when I started applying was 17% more pay in an area that was 15% less expensive to live. So combining those two factors together, that was effectively a 32% pay increase. That means by taking that job and moving to that location, I can maintain the same lifestyle and still have 32% of my income left over at the end from the pay increase and the decrease of living cost alone. But that's not even the job I took. So the job I actually took, when you couple that with the lower living costs and lower state taxes, was effectively a 43% pay increase. And again, that's to maintain the same exact lifestyle and having 43% more money. But right now, at the time of filming, the job market is even crazier. In the last 6 months alone, there are 3 people I know who have doubled their salary. There is another 10 people I know who have had at least a 50% pay increase in the last 6 months alone. And not only did all of their pay go up by that much, but in all of these cases, they either continued living in the same area so their expenses didn't go up, or they moved to a different area with lower expenses so they have less expenses on top of that big of a pay increase. But let's go to the real talk here. I said at the start of the series, way back in the introduction, that as I went on in this series, that the sacrifices I proposed would be more and more significant. So at least for me, the decision that I made, the decision to move several states away, to get a new job, to leave the relationships that I had and the friendships that I made, to leave what had been my entire life for the last several years behind, that was not a decision that I made lightly. But long term, surviving on that income level in that region, it just was not feasible. There was no way that I could reasonably make it work, let alone excel and get to the places I wanted to get to, unless I made that hard choice, unless I went through with it and I made that sacrifice. That is the only reason I was able to get as far as I am. That is the only reason I currently have this lifestyle and that I'm able to afford the things I have. The cost of living there and the taxes to live there were just so disproportionately and unreasonably high that even if I had my new salary in that old location, I can confidently tell you there is a 0% chance I would have made it as far as I have today. The only reason I can afford a house, the only reason I can afford multiple vehicles is because the cost of living here is just so much lower than where I was before. I recalculated recently what it would cost to own these same vehicles in that state based on my same income and based on living in this house with the property taxes there. If I took the same things that I currently have, if I had this house, if I had the same vehicles, but I had them in that state, it would cost me an additional $15,000 to $20,000 per year minimum to maintain these same things in that state, even though jobs in that state pay less on average than where I currently live. So here's the big takeaway, right? All the sacrifices that I described in levels 1 through 5, that's what enabled me to get by. When I did all of those things, that's when I had $25 per week left over after my basic expenses were paid. But doing this level, evaluating the cost of living, looking at the income level versus the cost of living for a different region, ultimately, this is the level that allowed me to actually get out of that hole to succeed. This is the thing that got me to that next level, so I actually had a reasonable quality of life. But like I said in the introduction video, right, the more that you give up and the earlier that you're willing to give it up, the earlier you'll be done with having to give it up. The sooner that you do these things and go through with them and commit to these changes, the sooner that you come out on the other side in a better financial situation where you no longer need to do them. But with that, congratulations, because now you have made it through level 6 of financial sacrifices. I will link the next video here on the screen for you. That's going to be the episode that ties everything together. But in the meantime, that'll do it for this episode. I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.